Today, we're getting under the hood with Dr. Beth Garner, a mother, daughter, sister, board-certified OBGYN, seasoned strategic and business-minded executive, and corporate board member with a career-long focus on addressing unmet needs and conditions and issues that affect women's health and quality of life. Born and raised in Nigeria, she brings a global view to her work in both the corporate and nonprofit worlds. Beth is currently the U.S. Chief Scientific Officer of Ferring, a leading mid-sized global company focused on reproductive and maternal health, microbiome and gastrointestinal therapeutics, and uro-oncology. She is on the board of directors of Kezar Life Sciences, Kezar, which develops novel therapies for autoimmune diseases and cancer, and Sermonix Pharmaceuticals focused on targeted breast cancer therapies. Beth was also recently appointed as the chair of the board of NUA Surgical, a startup company dedicated to creating innovative surgical solutions in obstetrics and gynecology. Beth serves on the board and is the current president of the American Medical Women's Association, AMWA, a professional organization whose mission is to advance women physicians, advocate for equity, and ensure excellence in healthcare. Dr. Garner received joint MD and MPH degrees from Harvard Medical and Public Health Schools. She trained in obstetrics and gynecology at Brigham and Women's Massachusetts General Hospitals and completed a fellowship in gynecologic oncology at BWH Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. Prior to transitioning into industry, she was an assistant professor at Harvard Medical School, where she focused on academic clinical practice in gynecologic oncology, basic science ovarian cancer research, and teaching and mentorship of residency and fellowship trainees and medical students. Elizabeth has extensive experience as a media spokesperson and is a frequent panelist and speaker on a range of topics, including innovation and investment in women's health, women's leadership, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and diversity in clinical trials. She is the author on close to 40 peer-reviewed scientific papers, and in 2019 and 2023, an awardee of the Pharma Voice 100 Most Inspiring Individuals in the Life Sciences Industry, and was the 2022 recipient of the Woman in Science Award from the American Medical Women's Association. So it's Women's Health Month, and it's also season 3, where we're continuing to speak with women who are making the world healthier. If it's okay, I would love to get going.
Sure thing.
And I really want to get under the hood of this. And the question I've been asking every woman is really like, what was that moment, that inflection point in your life that really directed you into healthcare and science?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And just to say, I'm really honored to be here today. I did take a look at some of your other podcasts. I'm like, oh my, I am among some really great people. So, and people that are truly making an impact on this, on this world. So amazing work that you're doing, and it's really appreciated. And I'm looking forward to all of the coming podcasts in the future because they're really cool. So in terms of, sort of what led me into thinking about women's health and being very focused on women, I would say my passion for women and their health definitely goes way back before any of my training, any of my medical training. And I would say all the way back to my upbringing in Nigeria. I was born and raised there. My mom is an American. She was in the Peace Corps, and met my dad in 1962 in Nigeria and stayed there and had a family. And for me, really at a young age, as a young woman, I started to see that around me, that especially looking at kind of my relatives as examples, I had a lot of female relatives, I saw that somehow women's needs didn't often come first, and in fact, often came last, despite the fact that women's roles were really foundational. They were the foundations of their families and their communities, and yet somehow their needs would, sort of be the last to be addressed. So that sort of really resonated with me. I was like, why is that exactly? And I did have a couple of really great role models. I had a pediatrician who was from Egypt, who was just an amazing person and just took great care of us, kids. And I was so impressed with her. And that was probably my first sense of like, aha, okay, so let's, put together kind of the doctor, women's issues, and okay, so now I'm kind of thinking about, medical journey, possibly. And I then, finished high school, came to the US and sort of thought, well, maybe things are better here for women, and realized pretty quickly I was at a women's college. We talked a lot about women and their sort of place in society, and it was clear that in many ways, it wasn't much different from Nigeria, right? Obviously, there were a lot of differences, but in terms of women not necessarily always having their needs addressed. So with that, through college, I'm sort of thinking about this, but still remembering my pediatrician doctor. So thinking, okay, I think I'll go to medical school, I'll be a pediatrician. I remember actually during some of our, the rotations that we would have, that I really was interested in OBGYN, but again, I felt like, that pediatrician thing was still there. And then once I actually did a rotation in pediatrics, I realized I was really quite bored by healthy people, but I sort of continued in that and ended up in sort of a primary care residency at first. And I was really bored because all the healthy young women were sent to me because I was the one doctor in the room or at that practice. And that was boring to me. I realized I wanted to take care of sick people. And that's what led me into GYN oncology. And all through that training, I realized women's issues in terms of health were just not being properly addressed. So as a couple of examples, I saw a lot of patients during my residency in OBGYN, pregnant women with preeclampsia, which can be a deadly disease, with preterm labor. I saw women with, struggling through menopause. I saw women with endometriosis and uterine fibroids. And for none of these conditions did I really have a really good solution. For preeclampsia, for preterm labor, we gave people, and still do today, which blows my mind, intravenous magnesium. Like, how is that really a medicine, right? And it didn't really cure the disease at all. It just gave us a couple of days to sort of help the baby mature a little bit more until, the woman was delivered. So it was very clear for me during my training that we needed better care. We needed better care for women. I didn't realize, and we can talk about this later, why that was. Like, why is it that women's health is so underserved? But certainly that is when I was aware, okay, I want to be in this field and I want to do something about it.
So I'd love to understand if you could share with the audience sort of your science experience. So when you went off to college, was science sort of something innate in you? Is it something you discovered? What was that sort of journey like?
Sure. And I was interested in science from a very early age, all the way in elementary school. I was sort of the math science person, although interestingly enough, I did major in college, both in biology and music. So as a young person, I was very musical as well. So, but they say, I've heard people say that doctors, often there's this relationship between doctors and music. But yeah, so I was, interestingly, again, back to sort of elementary school, there were lots of aspects of science that I really enjoyed, certainly biology and the human body and all of that. I have all these, there was one, I think it was something like what makes it, go or something like that, but it was all these amazing, perfect for someone my age, right? Just explaining all the different parts of the body and the different organs and the different systems. And so, yeah, I was always very, very interested. And then that continued in college. I majored in biology. I did an internship, with a doctor, make sure that medicine was the right way to go. And certainly I was like, yes, this is absolutely right. And then, through my years as a resident, I did small bits of research, not really in any major way, because obviously during your residency, you're running around taking care of patients. But when I was fellow, I was able to get a few grants to look at ovarian cancer. So this is now when I'm a GYN oncology fellowship. It's interesting because at that time, I really believed, actually just go back to sort of the practice of GYN oncology and back to this, like, women's needs are just not addressed. And ovarian cancer, right? So as a GYN oncologist, you see a lot of patients with ovarian cancer. And a GYN-onc is a surgeon, actually, right? We're more surgical than we are medical. So I would do these operations, really sick women with like, I mean, horrendous cancer. And, I would do a surgery. I'd have my fellow with me and we'd, be like so proud. We got all the cancer out. Yes. And then it would be back in 6 months. And you're like, oh my God. Right. And, as I saw this, over the years, I was like, this is just not okay. I mean, we need to and the surgeries were so challenging for the patients, obviously. Right. I mean, the recovery and yeah. So I really sort of felt like we need to better understand why this is happening, right? So I think we need to understand like literally the gene and go after it, right? So I was doing that in the lab. And what's crazy is, years later, that's what we do, right? I mean, and that's how we treat cancer. And that's how people who used to, who would die sort of very quickly are able to stay alive longer. My dad had lung cancer, and for 5 years, I mean, he already had metastatic cancer when he was diagnosed, and he took pills for 5 years that were addressing the specific mutations that he had in his cancer. So that advancement, but I'm always wondering, well, what if I'd gone down that path, right? So I went more women's health rather than oncology, but it's just been so exciting to see what's happened. So I was definitely, even back at that time, sort of aware that there were things that we needed to do from a deeply scientific point of view to cure things. And that's what we don't have still in women's health, right? Again, if you think about a lot of those conditions I just mentioned, we don't have targeted treatments. We give them magnesium or we do other things, we give them hormones, but it's not directly aimed at the underlying problem, which I think is a big issue for women's health and why we haven't advanced as much as we should.
Thank you for the work you've done in ovarian cancer. I lost my sister-in-law to it, and it was devastating, the experience. I can't even imagine being in that space and dealing with that. But I want to go back to, again, that the through line, the thread of that unmet need in women and then women's health, and the fact that you've been kind of not just witness, but a leader in sort of driving the change. So can you tell us sort of your story as you were in clinical practice, and then as you moved out of research and into external world, if you will?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, a lot of this was a lot of what I just described actually with my ovarian cancer patients, right? Where I was just like, okay, great that I can help, take the cancer out, and but then I mean, comes back, and that's just so awful. And what do we do about this? And I also had this feeling of the limitation, right, when taking care of patients. I loved it. Loved my patients, still in touch with some of them, but I've started to feel like, okay, I'm not able to have big enough impact by taking care of one patient at a time. Now, I must have already had that thought in my mind at some point, because in medical school, I actually did an extra year to do a master's in public health, right? So, and that was around international health and so on. So clearly, even at that point, I was like thinking bigger than just taking care of patients. So it must have sort of been back in there. And then as I started to see the actual limitations of clinical medicine, not only from a scientific standpoint, but also from an impact standpoint, right? I think that was there. And then it came around to, okay, it's an impact thing for me. It's impact. So I wasn't doing much about it. I mean, I wasn't, looking for any jobs, or I just knew that at some point I was going to have to do something, whether it was stop doing clinical medicine and just do research. That was an option, so, but that was going to be difficult for me to be in that environment and not take care of patients, right? I would have been very jealous of my colleagues, right? So I felt like I would have to leave if I was going to do that. And then honestly, I got an email from Merck that was an invitation to, come and take a look at the HPV vaccine program that was going on, that's Gardasil. Now, it had been just approved. The first indication was already approved. But obviously there was so much more to do. And so they were looking for a GYN oncologist who had, the background. And obviously a big part of my job clinically was also taking care of HPV related cancers, right? Like cervical cancer, vulvar, vaginal, all that stuff. So there you go. I was like, here's my opportunity for impact. Oh my God. I could possibly help impact millions of people, not even just thousands, but millions with that. And so, yeah, I jumped at the opportunity. I went, I interviewed, and I was like, yeah, absolutely. I've never seen science like this ever, even in the academic setting. I was just blown away. And so that was the leap. That was the jump over to the industry side. And it was all about trying to have bigger impact.
But I think it's very interesting to go from being a clinical practitioner affecting one patient at a time to affecting, millions at a time and having impact. And so how is that in terms of, not having the relationship more with the mass, like
Yeah,
your relationship in your head with the dynamic of no longer treating a patient, but treating a population? What's that like?
it's certainly very, very different. It's a different mindset, obviously, because you're not, directly taking care of patients. You're not ever even seeing patients, right? You have to just know they're out there and that you're having your impact, sort of indirectly. And for me, and I know there certainly are friends of mine who are like, I live to take care of my patients. I can't quite understand how you would make that leap. I haven't looked back at all, really. I mean, I miss taking care of patients for sure. And, every once in a while I think, well, okay, could I go do, some small stuff? I could do, colposcopy, right? I think I still would know how to do that. And so I think about that here and there. Right. I mean, there's so much more to be done, right? So many more, so many conditions that don't have solutions today, right? The science, and we can talk more about this, but the science in women's health has lagged way, way back. I mean, we just have not invested at all in the way that we need to address all of the issues, that women have. So for me, I think that impact part has made it not easy as such, but made it easier to leave the actual practice side.
Talk about the women's health, the observations in the general. You went into this specific area. What have you been seeing? What has your experience been like in that capacity?
But during my training, there were several, it was just crazy. There were several female relatives of mine back in Nigeria who died, conditions that I believed were preventable, right? So I had a cousin, Georgina, who died. And most of them, I don't even necessarily know what happened, right? For Georgina, for instance, I was able to get like one kind of ultrasound report. That was it. I mean, it's impossible almost to get records because people are, there's not great hospital care or anything. But I was able to get something to suggest that she probably had some kind of cancer, right? And I would imagine that she was probably bleeding forever, but, she wasn't married. I don't think she was sexually active, so no one would necessarily have known because she wasn't going to say anything. And we can talk about stigma in a while. We've got to talk about the stigma thing. But yeah, and then there are other cousins that died of like mental illness, totally untreated. I had a cousin that died in childbirth, and baby died as well. I mean, just horrible stuff. And I was just like, oh my God, like back to like, we just, but then also realizing that similar things happen in the US as well. And that is something I've become more and more aware of over time, right? In terms of the unmet needs and the disparities, right? That women face as opposed to men, but also different types of women in different groups, right? Also have their huge disparities that we can talk about. So all that to say that it's a driver for me, right? It's just a driver. And I have my kind of list of conditions, right? The serious stuff that really, really need to be addressed and still really aren't. But I think for you, it's sort of asking me about kind of the journey and what that's been like and sort of looking at the women's health landscape. About 3 years ago, something like that, I actually wrote about this. I was so like frustrated because at that point, I was in a women's health company and we just had terrible trouble getting investors to invest in us, right? And most of the time it was obviously for VCs, for instance, venture capitalists, like 90%, certainly of those folks who are the ones who are making decisions are guys. And oftentimes they know nothing about women's health. And we know investors invest in stuff they're comfortable with. So here we are showing up talking about fibroids, and they're like, what's that? So we had to educate from like the beginning, and to get them to the point where they would like really believe, you had to come up with something that would make it relevant to them, right? So in that sort of setting of me being in a small company trying to raise money, I was like, all right, this is just so frustrating. So I wrote this thing, this essay, if you want to call it, got it published. And I've looked back at it just recently because of what's happening and what's happened over the last 2-3 years, which is so exciting, so exciting, so exciting for the first time, right, ever. I'm like, wow, we are getting attention. There's finally attention, and there's finally recognition of the unmet needs that women have and what we've been suffering with for years and what we need to do about it, right? So it's been an incredible journey, but I think I'm at the point now where instead of being so pessimistic as I was in that essay of like, all the issues and how we're not addressing them and we need more investment, to now I'm optimistic, right, of the future because there's so much happening. We can talk about that in more detail.
But back to your story about, the women's health landscape changing. You've been doing so much work in that with all the companies, whether you're on the board of, you're sitting on the top of the associations. It would be great for you to share some of the work. And of course, you're at the White House for all the unveiling of the funding for women's health research. It would be great to understand your journey in that aspect, which is just another additional and wonderful layer to your amazing career.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. It's what's been happening. It's so exciting. And I know that what's so amazing about right now is that there's a community. I think you had so many of us kind of out there. We're out there. Who's listening? Who knows is there anybody else who's as frustrated as I am? Like, why am I not hearing people talk about this, right? And now, fast forward, there's truly a community. I mean, a huge community of all kinds of people, right? Whether it's investors, whether it's, physicians in industry, advocacy groups. I mean, just women. I mean, just so many different types of people that are coming together and pushing, right? And I think there were a few sort of really key things that happened, right? As I sort of think, okay, well, why did this all, why are we here today? And so I go back to that piece that I wrote where clearly I was like, I pointed to a couple of sort of articles that had been written around a couple of women's health issues, right? And so clearly there were starting to be some publications coming out, whether it was, news articles, mostly, journals that were, I was like, okay, there's starting to be some movement here, but I didn't yet feel like, okay, we are really going to change things. But I do think there were a few kind of key things that happened. So there's and you're probably aware of all of these as you've talked to a lot of people. The first, I think, was what we call the WHAM report, so Women's Health Access Measures. That came out 2020, I believe, and was all about the economic impact of health. And go back to the investors for one sec. Whether an investor, decides whether they're going to invest in something based on their return, what they believe they're going to get back. So I can't necessarily blame, I don't like that word, but the investors that I was talking to, because they didn't know. I mean, and that goes back to the stigma thing if we have time, but they didn't know. They weren't aware of these conditions, and there wasn't much out there, and there weren't many wins that they could point to say, yes, this is going to be a successful investment. I'm going to get, 3 times, 4 times, whatever the return is. So I can't blame them necessarily for that. But so when the WHAM report came out, I think that was very important, because it was like, there's huge economics here that we are just, not addressing. And sort of the final kind of suggestion for the WHAM report was, even if we just invested a small amount, maybe $350 million, I think is what they said, we would get huge returns on that. Even if we just, 350 million investment for research is so small. But they could see that even with that, we would make a big difference, right? So that was kind of the first thing I saw. I was like, oh my God, okay, somebody's talking about this. And then very soon after that was the first kind of McKinsey report that I think just laid everything out so beautifully, right? I mean, they defined women's health because investors and even women doctors, even folks that say American Medical Women's Association, when you talk about women's health, everybody thinks reproduction, and it's so much bigger than that, right? So I think what the McKinsey report did was open people's eyes that women's health isn't just reproduction. It's everything. It's everything from the very beginning of the lifespan all the way through, right, to menopause and beyond, right? So, and it's everything. So it's conditions that only affect women, right? Some of them I've mentioned. Then it's conditions that disproportionately affect women, right? Like autoimmune disease. And then it's conditions where women have, different presentation, right? So women affect women differently, like heart disease, right? So McKinsey just did such a great job of that, but also pointed out the lack of investment in a big way, right? So they showed that of the $200 billion that were spent in research, if you take out women's cancers, but if you look at women's conditions, it was 1% of the $200 billion going into research, right? Research and investment in women's health. So that was like in everybody's eyes, like opening people's eyes going, wow, this is. So if you put that together with the WAM report, you can see how it's now starting to be a true economic issue and one that potentially for investors, they could make money on, right? And then I think the third thing that was really important was the Innovation Equity Forum, which was this huge project that was done by the NIH and the Gates Foundation, where over like a year and a half, they brought together hundreds and hundreds of women's health experts from all over the world and put together what they called the opportunity map of like 50 top opportunities that foundations, investors, whoever could look at to address some of the major needs in women's health. So you put all that together. And if you think about all these things that are happening, there's conferences happening. There's the Women's Health Innovation Summits that started. That's another big piece of this, I think. And all of us who are thinking about this stuff are now meeting each other in person, like several times a year at all these various events. And the noise is just getting bigger and bigger over time. And I just think all of that big wave that came through started to get to like wham, there was a huge event that happened where, they had the congresswomen that were there, Nancy Pelosi came. Now it's getting the attention. And I think all of that sort of gradually then led to finally, right, the end of last year, the White House announcing that huge initiative, right? And you can imagine all of us going, oh my God, right, after all this, right? So this is why it's so exciting. And so we're continuing, meaning this, whatever you want to call it, coalition of continuing to now push, right? And like say, okay, you promise, so let's see, right? So you won't see us necessarily going, okay, cool. We've got 12 billion now, from Biden. Good, we're good. No. We have to make sure that it actually all gets done, right? But super exciting.
It's wonderful that you get to be a leader amongst that you get to attend these and be part of that wave of leadership who's directing that conversation and fueling it forward. I'd love to go back to your comment around the stigma.
Yes.
It's really important for us to talk about this stigma. And I want to say one other thing, Beth, which is I love that word unmet needs. Unmet needs, there's a relationship between unmet needs and stigma, I think. So
for sure, no question.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I think for me, when I really came to truly understand stigma, I'm sure I was aware of it, but it wasn't something that I was constantly thinking about, right? Even as a practitioner taking care of patients. And actually, when I look back at myself as a practitioner, there are things I know that I did not address properly for my patients, right? I know that because I'm like, oh, shoot, yeah. I think I had patients who came in and told me whatever, and I was like, well, not much I can do. I'm sure I know that, right? And pain and endometriosis, which can be such a complicated condition. I'm not sure I always did the right thing because, and some of it obviously is that you don't have anything to offer as treatment, so, and I think when doctors don't have anything to offer, they tend to just sort of move you on to the next doctor and see, right? So I think when the stigma thing really hit me was my cousin that I talked about, Georgina, because as I thought about what happened, I was like, she did not tell anyone. She didn't tell anyone what was happening, right? She was one of 5 siblings. All her siblings were guys. Her parents had died. She had nothing. I mean, absolutely nothing, just nothing. And there was no way she was going to go to her brothers and say, I'm bleeding. Just wasn't going to happen, right? So I'm quite sure that it was stigma that did not allow her to tell anyone what was going on, and which ultimately led to her death, right? So horrendous. Also, some of the other folks that I mentioned, my relatives, mental illness, stigmatized totally, right? So no one ever wanted to really talk about what was happening with, those people in our family who died because of their mental illness. And then I think the death of my cousin, actually it was my cousin's wife, in childbirth, even that was very difficult for him to, talk about. So stigma. And then as I started to look at sort of women's health, I was like, okay, so many of the things that we aren't addressing are things that no one wants to talk about. And if you think back to investors, they have no idea. Like, do women, show up and talk about infertility or like their miscarriages or their hot flashes or their pain? I mean, all of these things. And so over time, I was like, this is a big problem. And remember, for 8 years of my career, I'm speaking to investors like all the time. That was a big part of my job, right? And so they'd be like, sometimes it's embarrassments, but a lot of time it was just like literally clueless, and I'm like, most of these guys are married to men, are married to women. They have kids, they have girls, and don't know anything about periods, about anything, right? I'm like, but you're an investor in healthcare. No idea. So that's where I really started to realize, okay, so investment in women's health, if we're talking investors, there's investment, obviously just the science, that's academics and so on. But when I think about the investor world, certainly where we need money from investors to develop things, right? And if they don't even have a clue because no one talks about it, that's a problem. Because then you've got, and I actually had to put together this kind of circle thing, right? And then I saw that somebody else had done it before me, but where it was like stigma, and dismissal of symptoms and stuff that leads to like lack of awareness, that leads to then not, sort of an underestimation of what the burden is, right? I mean, you could maybe convince an investor that yes, women have this problem, but it's not that huge, is it? It's not. It's like, yes, it's huge, right? And so there are certain assumptions that are made about whether there's even anything to gain from an investment standpoint. So it's sort of, there's certain assumptions. And so obviously, if you assume you're not going to get much return, then you're not going to invest. Without the investment that we need, I think this has directly led to the fact that for most of these conditions that we've been talking about today, we don't actually have really, really good science. And if you don't have good science, you can't solve the problem. And an investor is going to be like, well, it's great that you're telling me about this condition, but what's the science and do we even know what's happening? What's the mechanism? And if you don't know, investors are, they need to kind of understand what it is that they're actually dealing with. So that is lack of investment. Then with that means lack of innovation because we don't understand the science well enough, right? And then it just keeps going round and round and round and round and round, so we've got to break, I feel, the stigma part. It's just got to be broken, right? And so I often say, stamp it out. We got to stamp out stigma, right?
That because of all that, women are living needlessly with conditions for longer, but they become dismissive of their conditions because the system has dismissed them. I think everything that's going on with these initiatives is extraordinary. but it will be very curious to see what does that mean? What is the outcome? What are we measuring? What are the things? Is it, because there are so many, it's really interesting. There's a lot out there, a lot of
So much, yeah.
creating businesses around
Yeah.
their own personal unmet needs and journeys to sort of
Yeah.
solve, but
Yeah.
it's pervasive, right?
Think about the conditions I, sort of have been talking about, where we don't know kind of the underlying science to actually get now to the point where we have therapeutics, drugs, treatments, cures. That's going to take a while, right? So I think we just have to really be patient, because science takes time. And so that's where I think we all sort of in this coalition community, whatever you want to call it, have to, remain vigilant and patient, but also ensure that that science piece happens, right? I think femtech has led the way, because at least with the femtech world, investors are hearing, about women's health. I think many of them are, especially VCs, I think are going to lean towards femtech, right? Because returns, right? Which for them is great. These are going to be longer returns, right? So that's where I think we've got to really, really do our diligence and push.
Well, it's very interesting that you say that. So it was 30 years ago, 1993, that
Yeah.
women were invited into clinical trials. And I say invited because they weren't included in everything. They were invited into clinical trials. And so it's 30 years later. And I know that WIM has their 30, not 30 or something.
Three, not 30, 3, not 30.
Not 3, not 30, 3 years, not 30. But to your point,
Yeah.
thank you for that, Beth. Thank you for that. But I think the point being that, to your point, to get to the underlying root cause and stuff, it takes time. You have to do the science before you can even flip the product, which, R&D is typically 10 years to get a product.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And we're way, way behind, because if several years ago, many of the bigger companies that were actually doing that early science stopped. So literally science just kind of stopped. And so now it's got to be built back up. We've got to lean heavily on, our academic colleagues, right? I think that there are many more out there who are doing this type of work. They just haven't had that interest from industry. Great example. I'll give you one amazing example. A really, really excellent article from Yale Medicine that was last year. I forget what month. It was all about herpes. You want to talk about stigma. Herpes is I think of all stigmas, the stigma, right? For, for certainly young people. If they get herpes, it's oh my God, life is over. And there are scientists who are doing work on treatments for herpes, but also vaccines, to actually prevent the disease. And in this article, the article is specifically, I forget the exact title, but it's about how stigma around herpes has actually prevented development of treatments, vaccines, it's actually stopped at stigma, because even there's stigma just of people who have the condition. There's stigma of people who, don't even want to talk about it. But even companies have felt, ooh, that's, I'm not sure I want to go there. I mean, that's crazy. This is a huge problem, right? And it's increasing because young people are, for whatever reason, various reasons, sexually transmitted infections are going up, not down in the US. So, including herpes, right? So we need a solution, we need prevention. But even companies are tend to shy away from wanting to do that work. And they actually interviewed a woman who's a professor at Yale who specifically said, oh, industry, I have a possible vaccine that I think might work, but no one from industry is calling. Terrible, right? So, yeah.
And the irony is, if I don't know how many 1 in whatever patient people have herpes, but talk about a win. You both sit and help a really, uncomfortable chronic condition, as well as you make a lot of money. I mean, it's like just so foolish. It's foolish on a business level and then foolish
Yeah,
on a human level. Like, because if you can halt any
yeah,
sort of progression of something like that, why wouldn't you?
right,
Yeah, I go back to
right.
this is my line. It just doesn't make sense. But that's a really great, I think that's a really interesting thing. So I'm curious because, we're coming to a close. I have two questions left. This one is like, so you've been part of all this, Beth, Dr. Garner, you've been part of all of this transformation and seeing, and I think I really want to call attention to you being a gynecologic oncologist. So someone who is treating
Yeah,
patients clinically, you're in a very, very detailed treating sick patients. Now you've gone into public health and being able to affect, not public health, from being able to treat and affect and impact, millions of people with the work you're doing. So you've been through your journey in your life has really seen so much change and so much, macro, micro, if you will. As you're beginning and
yeah.
all news has come out, how are you imagining? What are you thinking you're seeing the next 3 5 years? What does the world look like in women's health to you?
I think that we will certainly be seeing more science simply because there's now money for it, right? So with the with the White House initiative, 100 million there, 12 billion, that Joe Biden announced, there's more interest, right? And so you're going to, just by definition now, people will realize, oh, that question I wanted to answer in whatever condition, I can now get funding for it, right? So you're going to see an increase, I believe, I hope, in the science piece, right? And hopefully, what I'm hoping is in the next, year-ish, we will hear about even more funding, right? That's the key, is we need funding for all of this, right? So assuming that does happen, it continues to happen, we will start to see more science. With that science, hopefully, there will be some indicators, right, around specific, better understanding of what's happening to cause many of these conditions, right? So endometriosis, what causes it? What causes fibroids, all that, right? What causes preterm labor? There's science out there, but there's no something really we all believe is, yes, this is a science, and we can go on now to develop therapeutics treatments, right? So I don't think in 3 years we're going to be there at actually having drugs. We will have some, I think, really, really strong hypotheses and early science that's happening. But even with that, if there's solid enough science, you will start seeing some investment, right? I mean, when you've got solid science, investors for, say, small companies, they'll invest super early if the science is right, right? So that's what I'm hoping to see in the next 3 to 5, is much more science coming out and investment. So that we've got now, rather than like one company that's focused on women's health, we'll have maybe 15 or 20. And that, again, I'm not talking about tech, just because there are tons of companies doing tech. I'm talking really more on the therapeutics side, where we have really not many folks on focusing on that.
Well, thank you for that. What just occurred to me as I'm listening to you is talking that's really from the science perspective. I think it's really interesting because a number of the conversations I've been having with some physicians is really about the lack of women's health literacy, like women knowing their bodies, really understanding.
Huge.
So if we close those two gaps, and again, being patient, taking time, but being religious, diligent, just pressing on, right? Because where a woman knows, then she goes into the doctor's office. But of course, I was in one conversation with, I think it was Women's Health Society, and they were talking about the fact that there aren't enough specialists to address the problems in women's health. So there's an issue there.
Yeah, agreed.
I think
agreed. I also hope, I think in the next 3 to 5, I think because there's been so much talk about this, I hope that sort of the stigma level starts to go down, right? And that we can really kind of break that as well, so that, folks who are out there doing science, investors, will be much more aware, right, of all the conditions that 50% of the population is dealing with, right? And so they will then start to think, oh, it's not a niche area. This is not niche. It's not a niche market. this is a market where I can really make some solid money, right? So I think hopefully that mindset also in the next 3 to 5 years will have changed. We'll be in a better place.
Yeah, and I go to, it's really interesting as well. It's like, yes, we'll make money, but you'll also be doing good and doing the right thing. Better humanity, but who cares?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to be on that. I am, I believe in capitalism. We should make money, but it's really important because at the day, the impact would be dramatic for like
well, and that's
changing women.
Well, exactly. And I think the other piece too is, and you have a lot of people that say this, and I say this often too, which is when women are healthy, everybody else is healthy too. So that's the part with like the male investors, you gotta get them to understand why it's good for them also, not just from the monetary side, but also why, hey, you know what? Yeah, if my daughter is, happy or whatever, I'm gonna be happier. If my wife is, or whoever. Everybody does better when women do better, right? So that's also, I think, really important to get that word out also.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more. I mean, this has been, you're living in an extraordinary life. I would imagine it's been fascinating to be in your world and experiencing all these things. So I hate to close out this conversation. I have one last question though, which is, this is your platform today, to give a message to women all around the world of all ages, of all backgrounds, and all cultures. What do you want to say to them?
I think what I would say to women around the world is that you matter, your needs matter. Take care of yourself, because if you take care of yourself and you insist that others support you, everyone will do better, as we just said.
That's amazing. And it's such a simple, on-point message that, taking care of yourself. You are amazing. I'm so honored to have gotten under the hood with you, particularly during Women's Health Month. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Much appreciated and so much fun to talk to you.
Thanks for listening to Under the Sisterhood. If you haven't already, please give us a quick rating and review on Apple or Spotify. And make sure to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn so you can hear from more amazing women. This podcast is created and hosted by Under the Sisterhood LLC and Elizabeth Elfenbein, produced by Elizabeth Elfenbein and Matt Butler, and edited by Matt Butler. The music is by Ayla Schaefer. Her song, Rose.